Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to more Reddit stories. We have a pretty good batch tonight. It's late here, and I wanted to read some Reddit stories, and I thought that I'd read them for you guys too. So yeah, let's just get into this. Thanks for watching. This first one is from Mr. Outlaw. A few weeks ago, I agreed to enter an experimental haunted house. The most terrifying thing you will ever experience. Do you dare? That was the exact phrase that had been printed onto the flyer. I had stumbled out of a bar one night preparing to walk back to my apartment when I noticed it. The flyer had been stapled to a telephone pole, nearly buried beneath several others. Halloween was coming up, so I'd already seen plenty of advertisements for various kinds of haunted houses. But this one stood out, largely due to how different it looked from the rest. I guess you could have called it a bare-bones design. Other than the slogan, which was in large, bold letters, the only thing that had been printed on there was an email address near the bottom. Strange, but I liked it. It intrigued me. I took a picture of it, and once I got home, I sent an email stating that I'd seen the flyer and was curious as to what this was all about. They got back to me the next morning. "Hey there, glad we've caught your attention. We're a new startup company that aims to deliver revolutionary horror experiences. Think about the classic haunted house you'd find at fairs or in your local community. They're fun for the family, a good option for a first date. But have you ever actually been scared by one of these? What we've developed here transcends that. What we're offering is an opportunity to experience true primal fear. Are you brave enough to find out what we have in store?" I thought it was a bit corny at first. How are you going to shit on the very concept of a haunted house when that's exactly what you were marketing? But as skeptical as I was, I still reckoned that it could be something worth checking out. I hadn't been to a haunted house in a while. Maybe they really did have a unique spin on it. I replied, stating that I was indeed brave enough to check it out, that I'd like to know more about what they were offering. This time, they got back to me within the hour, providing a more in-depth explanation. Essentially, their twist on the conventional haunted house was that it wouldn't take place in a house at all. Not some makeshift DIY thing either. They were going to set it up in an abandoned building near the edge of the city. But there was another layer to it, because apparently nobody knew what the building had actually been used for, why it even existed at all. There were even rumors that it just appeared one day out of thin air, that it wasn't even man-made. I wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean, but it was pretty decent marketing. That much I couldn't deny. But things have gotten expensive these days, and it's left me with a pretty tight budget. And with what sounded like such an elaborate setup, I had my doubts that I'd be able to afford the entrance fee. I brought this up to them in my next email, and they told me that wouldn't be a problem, that I wouldn't actually need to fork up any cash at all, because they'd be compensating me for my time. $400 cash to be dispersed at the end, because technically the project was still in its developmental phase, that this was only going to serve as a test run and experiment. They assured me that they had implemented rigid safety protocols, that they themselves had gone through it several times, and could say with confidence that there was no risk of anybody getting hurt. At this point, I honestly couldn't believe my luck, because quite frankly, the money would have been real nice. I suppose that I was ecstatic enough that I had stopped analyzing the situation through a critical lens, but I don't know. What would you have done if you were me? Would you have questioned things more? Be honest with yourself. I sent a reply telling them that I was in, to go ahead and tell me exactly what I needed to do. Their reply was short, to the point, just a set of coordinates along with a time and date. Also a note stating that they'd cover any travel expenses so long as we kept our receipts. 9 a.m. on October 26th. I put the coordinates into Google and it turned up a 35-minute drive out to an area that I'd never been before. Looked like some country road with a forest on one side and a large cornfield on the other. But I didn't see a building, which bothered me for reasons that I couldn't really comprehend at the time. Just not nearly enough to dissuade me altogether. I asked them if I could bring somebody along, and they told me that I could, but that they only had one spot left and it was first come, first serve. I considered asking my girlfriend Luna, but realized that the idea of driving out to some abandoned road to enter some sketchy building might not be terribly appealing to her. So then I thought about who might really need the money, and it was an obvious choice. My friend Josh. Met him in college and we'd been good friends ever since. It's been nearly 6 years since we graduated, and I don't think he's ever worked at the same company for longer than 3 months. And over these past few years, I don't think he's been working at all. You know those reels where the caption's like, your unemployed friend on a Tuesday afternoon, and it's some guy feeding a llama in a jungle or something? That's him. He has no car, lives in a shitbox studio with no apartment. How he even has the money to pay for rent or food, I couldn't begin to guess. Savings, he tells me. Whatever that means. Predictably, Josh seemed pretty enthused by the idea when I brought it up. He almost sounded relieved. On the morning of the 26th, I picked him up and we drove all the way out there. Based on the story so far, you may be under the impression that I'm not the brightest, but I'm not a complete idiot either. I let Luna know exactly where I was going, told her that if I wasn't picking up my phone at around noon, then something might be up. We arrived at the coordinates at around 8:40. It really was just a random spot on the road. There was a small clearing in the forest where a few cars were already parked, so I followed suit and backed my Nissan into it. After parking, we got out. The air was cold and crisp, and the skies above were a deep blue. We looked around at the 4 people who were already there. One of them was a younger girl, maybe in her late teens or early 20s, wearing a jacket with the hood pulled up, athletic leggings, sneakers. She was sitting on a tree stump with her arms crossed. And then there was a couple that appeared to be in their 30s sitting on the hood of their car. They both seemed to be mildly annoyed, and I couldn't tell if it was because of each other or if they were actively regretting their decision to be there. Finally, there was a guy that could have been in his early or mid-20s. Tall and lean with sharp features, his hair bleached and buzzed close to the scalp, a tattoo of what appeared to be a tiger on his neck. He was dressed in what I can only describe as tactical streetwear, and he was the only one that acknowledged our existence. He walked over to us with this huge grin on his face and shook both of our hands. He introduced himself as Kijun, told us that he was visiting from Korea for the week. We asked him why he'd chosen to come here out of all places, since our city was far from being anything close to a tourist destination. He explained that this haunted house was actually an urban legend of sorts, but one that had more credibility than most others, because there were actual official police reports detailing cases where people had gone missing after entering the place, ones that had since been scrubbed from public records. I asked if he'd actually read these reports himself, and he said that he didn't, that they were pretty hard to find, but that he was really into this sort of thing, the weird, the strange, the dangerous. So he'd done as much research as he could and found some contacts in America who clued him in on this place, and now he was here. I wasn't sure whether I really believed him. I looked at Josh and could tell that he was feeling something similar, that Kijun must have been somebody hired by the company and given a script to try and freak us out. And if that had been the case, it was kind of working right then. But before we could ask him anything else, another vehicle pulled up. A black Mustang, new and shiny. It parked against the hill leading down to the clearing before 2 young guys climbed out of it, both wearing college football jerseys. They both appeared to be drunk, perhaps also high on coke. They were laughing, stumbling over their feet as they made their way toward us. They told us that their names were Chad and Harrison, and we spent a painful few minutes trying to have a conversation with them before somebody walked out of the forest. A sharp-looking guy in a suit, maybe early 30s, looked like he belonged in a boardroom somewhere. Thinking about it now, I don't think I actually heard or saw him coming out of the woods. He just kind of appeared. He introduced himself as Sinclair, the CEO of the startup. He told us how nice it was to meet everyone and that he'd be the one guiding us over to the building. Kijun raised a hand and asked him what the actual name of the startup was. Sinclair smiled, told him that it was a work in progress, that he wasn't at liberty to divulge much in the way of details. After he'd answered, Kijun looked over at us and raised his eyebrows as if to signal, "Hey, isn't that fucking weird?" And it was. This whole thing was extremely bizarre, and only now was I starting to realize it. At the same time, I figured that maybe it was all part of the show, that it was meant to be as immersive as possible, and in that case, they were doing a hell of a job. I looked around at the others. Chad and Harrison seemed too drunk and coked out to really give a shit. The couple appeared to be quietly arguing with each other, which kept them preoccupied. From eavesdropping in on their conversation, I learned that their names were Liam and Deb. The girl in the jacket was stone-faced, staring blankly ahead. It was hard to tell what she was thinking. And then of course there was Ki Jun. Sinclair asked if there were any more questions, and Josh raised a hand, asked why we hadn't just met at the building directly. Sinclair told him that there were no roads leading to it, that it would be difficult to find without a guide who knew exactly where they were going. Josh asked what that was supposed to mean. Sinclair told him that we'd all find out soon enough. He told everybody to come with them before turning around and walking into the forest. We all hesitated for a moment before following. We walked along a rough trail for about a half hour before arriving at a huge, unnatural-looking clearing. And there it was. An actual building in the middle of the woods. It was about the size of a small corporate office, painted dark gray, 3 stories tall. The strangest thing about it was that it didn't even look terribly dilapidated. Not that it looked brand new or anything. Sections of the paint had started to peel and a few of the windows were cracked, but it really didn't seem like it had been abandoned for long. It looked like it could have been functional just a few years prior. But functioning as what? What the hell was it doing out here? Well, this is it, Sinclair said. We all stared at him. For a while, nobody said a word. Even the cocaine bros had been rendered silent. So, this is something you guys built? Liam asked him. I mean, are you really sure it's safe? Sinclair looked at him. I can assure you we've done our due diligence and that there's absolutely nothing to be worried about, he said. We've cleared all the debris, accounted for any electrical hazards, unstable floors, everything. Nothing to worry about. Liam didn't seem so convinced, but then Deb nudged him. This was your idea, she whispered through gritted teeth. So relax. She paused, took another look at the building. Besides, this might be interesting. Liam rolled his eyes, then looked back at Sinclair. You know, if anything goes wrong, there's gonna be hell to pay. I haven't signed any waivers yet, and I'm not going to. Sinclair put his hands up in a playful, defensive gesture. I hear you, I understand, but there's really nothing to worry about, nothing to sign. That's how much we trust it. But you didn't answer my first question, Liam continued. Did you guys build this? It looks awfully expensive for what you're trying to do here. We didn't build it, Sinclair told him. As expressed in prior communications, we don't know who built this place. We don't know where it came from. Liam scoffed. So this is like still part of the act, or are you being serious? I can't tell anymore. Sinclair stared at him. We really don't know. Chad and Harrison began laughing. This is some freaky ass shit, I heard one of them say. Any more questions or concerns? Sinclair asked us. Silence followed. Sinclair's smile returned, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He opened it up, revealing a stack of $100 bills. As stated, your compensation will come out to $400. $200 up front, and then the other $200 once we've finished everything up. So please form a line. We did just that, each taking our promised amount. I could see Josh's eyes lighting up as his fingers touched the cash. Once everybody had gotten their money, Sinclair led us over to one of the building's entrances. It'll be a simple process, he told us. Go inside, follow the red arrows that have been taped to the walls until you've reached the exit. It should take around 30 minutes in total. I'll be waiting at the end. With that, he walked off to the side and gestured for us to enter. I'd be lying if I said my expectations hadn't been set high at this point. The entire buildup had been unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. My heart was beating heavy. I was excited. Inside, it just looked like any bog standard office, though the harsh, incandescent light did give it an eerie liminal vibe. I suppose that was the angle they were going for. No cobwebs, no pots of boiling blood, no skeletons hiding underneath floorboards waiting to jump out and grab your ankles. Just an empty building. But there was something strange about it, a subtle feeling. It wasn't just the fact that it was deep inside a forest. There was something else. Something hard to identify. Something uncomfortable. I reckon everybody else started feeling it as well because nobody was saying a word. But we sucked it up and began following the tape down the first corridor. It stretched on for a good bit before we turned into another one, and then another. After traversing through several more identical-looking corridors, we realized what was wrong with this place. The layout didn't make any sense, just a bunch of hallways with no actual rooms. It was almost disorienting, and this is the point where Chad told us he was heading back, that he wouldn't go any further. We turned to look at him. He had already started lagging well behind the rest of the group, his face painted with a pretty earnest expression of terror. Harrison asked him what was wrong. He looked at the floor and then at the walls and then back at us. He shook his head. "I'm not going any further," he repeated. Before we could say anything else, he'd turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. "Hey man," Harrison called after him. "What the hell are you doing?" He then shook his head. "The fuck's his problem?" he muttered to himself. "Aren't you gonna go after him?" Kijun asked. Harrison shook his head. "Fuck that, I need the money." We ventured on. After 5 or 6 or maybe 10 more corridors, I was starting to get the itch to turn back as well. There wasn't even an explicit threat, just this constant, relentless feeling of what the fuck is going on. I asked Kijun what he thought about it, but he didn't answer. Instead, he seemed to be fixated on one of the walls. After a while, I realized why. There was no tape on either of the walls. I couldn't recall a point where I'd consciously took stock of the fact that the arrows were no longer there. I guess we just hadn't been paying attention. I looked back down the corridor we just walked through and saw that there was no tape behind us either. Had we just been moving around aimlessly? And for how long? Why hadn't we noticed? "Alright, there's no fucking way that we're lost in here," Liam declared. "The building wasn't that big from outside." "I don't like this," Deb said to him. "Let's get the hell out of here." "Oh, now you want to leave? Are you gonna tell me you want to fucking stay?" He thought about it for a moment and then shook his head. "Hell no." They turned around, began walking away. "Hey, that's not the right direction," Kijun called after them. Josh looked at him. "What are you talking about? That's where we came from." Kijun stared back at him. Are you sure?" I looked around and tried to figure it out for myself, and I realized I wasn't sure. Without the arrows, everything kind of just looked the same, but I told myself that wasn't a problem. Walk around enough and eventually we'll make it out, right? But for whatever reason, I couldn't seem to convince myself that this was the case. "You guys are overreacting," Harrison told us. "We came from there," he pointed behind us. "So obviously we're supposed to go there." He then pointed ahead. His voice was loud, but there wasn't much confidence behind it. But at the same time, we couldn't really argue with him. We had to go somewhere. So we walked on. More and more corridors. Soon 15 more minutes had passed, and still no sign of an exit, or a room, or even a dead end. Was it possible that we were just continuously traversing through a loop? I started keeping track of the turns we were taking. Left, left, right, left, 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 right, right. Clearly we weren't. I took out my phone to find that the signal was dead. I asked around, and so was everybody else's. 10 more minutes, and now the panic had turned into one hell of a thing. The space was starting to feel claustrophobic, almost threatening. Harrison had started jogging ahead, and we struggled to keep up with him. I looked over at Kijun, seeing that the excitement once present in his face had been drained almost completely away, replaced with this sense of cautious bewilderment. After what must have been our 100th turn, there finally came a change in the scenery. A single window sitting at the end of yet another corridor. It was the first window that we'd seen the entire time that we'd been in there, so it was quite the jarring visual. But it was also a potential way out. We began walking towards it when the girl in the jacket told us not to, that we needed to turn around and get away from it as soon as possible. It was the first time that we'd even heard her speak. Up until that point, she'd just been following silently along. We weren't really sure what her deal was, but I suppose we had been too preoccupied to ask. Harrison looked at her. What the fuck are you talking about?" "We shouldn't go near any windows," she told him. "We should turn around." "Or what? What's gonna happen?" "I don't know exactly," she said, "but probably nothing good." Harrison shook his head. "Yeah, fuck that, and fuck the money. I'm getting out of here." He marched towards the window, with Josh and Kijun following close behind. I stayed back and asked the girl how she knew that going near the window would be dangerous. She told me that it was a long story, that she'd explain it later, but for now we really needed to leave. "If they aren't going to listen to me, then go over there and convince them," she said to me. "If we don't leave soon, then I'm going on my own. That window is not a way out." I could see her expression crack, a quiver in her lip. She was almost pleading. If she wasn't dead serious, then she was one hell of an actor. I asked her if she was aware of something that we weren't, if she knew something that we didn't. "We don't have time for me to explain it all to you," she said. "We need to leave." I really didn't want to believe her. I wanted to believe that the window was really a way out. And in that moment, I managed to convince myself that her words were just fear manifesting into paranoia. I turned away from her and walked over to the window. The others were all huddled up against it, and I asked them what they were seeing. Josh turned around. He looked both confused and horrified. "Take a look." He made some space for me, and I squeezed in. And at first, it felt like my brain was short-circuiting. Outside, there were no trees, no brush, just a wide, open field blanketed by heavy fog. Definitely not the forest we'd come in from. Kijun suggested that maybe it was painting. But if you took a good look at it for more than a few seconds, you'd realize that it definitely wasn't. The mist was moving, slowly rolling forward, wind blowing through the grass. Harrison suddenly backed up, delivered a hard kick to the glass. It didn't crack. It didn't even shake, it just made a dull thudding noise, as if it were solid concrete disguised as a window. He shook his head, tried kicking it again, and then again, and again. But then he stopped, started squinting at something through the glass. We asked him what he was seeing, and he told us to take a look for ourselves. At first, the fog made it difficult to tell exactly what it was. Just some vague shape in the distance, getting steadily closer. So we all stood still and just stared at it. I guess we were too shocked to really do anything else, but soon it was close enough that we could tell it was human-shaped. A man, sprinting right towards us. He was naked and his skin appeared to be burnt. He had long, wild hair that was sticking out at odd angles. We began to back away. I turned around and saw that the girl was already gone. The man continued barreling towards us, and soon we could make out some of his more peculiar features. Like the fact that his arms were so long that his fingers were scraping the top of the grass. We didn't wait for him to get any closer, and we turned and ran. As we rounded the first corner, we could hear the glass break, something heavy smacking down onto the floor. We ran faster, though it quickly became clear that Harrison was the fittest among us. He turned around, shouted at us to catch up, but we were unable to. Soon he was out of sight, leaving us in the dust. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like steel. I just tried to push forward. Something that sounded like a horse croaking reverberated through the corridors, accompanied by the sound of dense, uneven footsteps. It was hard to tell exactly how far away they were, but certainly close enough for me to start losing my shit. The three of us turned another corner and then skidded to a stop. There was a door in the wall. The first door we'd actually seen in this place apart from the entrance. We stared at it as we caught our breath, listening to footsteps and the croaking getting closer. Then we stared at each other, all coming to a mutual understanding. The door likely wasn't going to lead us anywhere we wanted to be, but we couldn't run forever. We opened it up and rushed in, slamming it shut behind us. We found ourselves standing in complete darkness. For a while we didn't move, didn't make a noise, we just held our breaths, listening to the footsteps as they continued to close in on us, praying that they'd run right past, which thankfully they did. But even after they had long faded away, we remained standing there, still terrified to move. It took a while for us to feel secure enough to move and speak freely. Once we did, we took out our phones and turned on our flashlights, illuminating a room that looked like something ripped straight from some obscure nightmare. The walls and floor appeared to be made out of old, severely rusted metal. We hadn't really taken stock of the smell at first, but now it was heavy, delivering an assault on our senses. The room was no bigger than a standard high school classroom, but it was completely empty, the only thing in there, apart from the door we'd entered through, being two sets of stairs, one leading up, the other leading down. Neither option seemed particularly enticing, and we began to argue about what we should do next. We first decided to try leaving the room, gambling on the idea that we wouldn't have to run into whatever the hell had broken through the window. But when we tried to open the door, we weren't able to. It had locked itself from the inside. We tried forcing it open by taking turns slamming our shoulders into it, but it never came close to budging. So we settled on going up instead. We began climbing the stairs and we just kept climbing. It took us far too long to realize what was wrong, because we should have reached the second floor long ago. Even if these stairs went all the way up to the third, we should have been there at that point. The building could not have been more than 30 or 40 feet tall, and we'd been walking for over 20 minutes. We also noticed that the air had grown thicker. It was becoming difficult to breathe. We began retreating down the steps, and once again, the stairs wouldn't end. Not after 30 minutes. Not after an hour. I could hear Josh starting to hyperventilate, and I tried to calm him down. Eventually, he did. And then we just sat there. We were exhausted, mentally whipped. Kijun's phone was the first to die, and then so did Josh's. Now we were down to one light, and it wouldn't be much longer before we were in the dark. After a while, we could hear footsteps moving up towards us. We stood up, ready to sprint again, when a familiar voice called up to us. "Wait, it's me!" I angled my light down the steps, and it revealed the girl in the jacket. But I was too paranoid at this point to fully accept that this wasn't some kind of trick, so I continued to back away. "Don't freak out," she continued. "It's me, it really is." She seemed earnest enough. I asked her where she'd been this entire time. She shook her head. "I don't know, just around, I guess." I asked her what the hell that was even supposed to mean, and why she seemed so relaxed. "Look, I'll tell you," she told me, "but we need to get out of the stairs first. It's dangerous here." I told her to tell us what she knew about this place that we apparently didn't, that if it might help us escape this place alive, we deserved to know. She took a deep breath, and then she told us that her name was Nadia. Some time ago, her brother Anton had gone into one of these, and he hadn't come back out. I asked her what one of these was supposed to mean. She explained that this place can appear in different locations and can take on different forms. The one that her brother had gone into had been in a different city altogether. He'd also been part of a group of 8, and out of those 8, only 3 were ever seen again. 2 of them had made it all the way to the end, while the 3rd had left very early on. Her brother's girlfriend, Dixie, had been one of the 2 that made it to the end. "So this place ends?" Josh asked her, hopeful. She nodded. "Eventually it should. According to Dixie, we just have to deal with a lot of shit before it finally does." As she was speaking, I felt a sudden flash of anger. I asked her why the hell she hadn't stopped us from coming in here in the first place. If she was privy to all this information, why didn't she just tell us from the get-go? "Would you have believed me?" she replied. "If I'd caused a scene out on that road and told everybody that this was some fucked up dangerous place, would you have believed it? Or would you have thought I was psycho or paid to promote this place or something?" I thought about it for a while, and I really wasn't sure. I then asked her why she decided to come back herself. She said it was to try and find Anton. She didn't think he was dead, just trapped in here somewhere. She said she was going to get him out. She'd gotten as much information out of Dixie as possible and then went and did some of her own research. But she'd gone a lot deeper than Kijun had, managing to track down first-hand accounts of others who had entered and survived this place. Though a lot of it ended up being incoherent, their memories of the place being scattered, hazy, unconsciously repressed. But what she was able to conclude from all of it was that if you ever found yourself in here, you just had to keep going. Even when the desperation hits and you're terrified and things seem hopeless, you just keep going, because eventually the place will let you go. But only after you've proved to it that it isn't going to be able to break you. It could take hours, maybe days, but you had no other option. She also mentioned that if anything seems even remotely dangerous in here, it most certainly is. She then told us that we needed to get moving, back up the stairs. We asked why up and not down. She said that's just what she'd read from the reports. Something about how once you were in the basement, you were basically in hell and you were never getting out. It was a lot to take in and process, but we felt it best to just listen to her. So we began moving up the stairs. I think I'll stop it there for now. I still have a lot to tell you, but I've gotten a bit tired typing this all out. I'll update when I can. This next one is from Gamel Frank. I am an urban explorer. I can't call the police about the hunting lodge I found, so I am confessing here. My entire adult life has been dedicated to urban exploration. I find abandoned places, photograph the decay, and document the slow reclamation of man-made structures by the natural world. I usually target old industrial sites, forgotten asylums, and decaying commercial properties. A few weeks ago, I found a deeply buried thread on an obscure mapping forum discussing an undocumented hunting lodge situated in a vast, unnamed stretch of dense wilderness. The coordinates were approximate, derived from a decades-old survey. The coordinates were approximate, derived from a decades-old surveying map that had been scanned and uploaded by an amateur archivist. The extreme isolation of the structure appealed to me. I packed my heavy canvas rucksack with survival gear, extra water, a high-lumen tactical flashlight, and a secondary backup light. I drove for 6 hours, leaving the interstate for rural highways and eventually turning onto a dirt logging road that had not seen vehicle traffic in years. I parked my truck behind a dense thicket of overgrown brush, locked the doors, and began the hike. The forest was incredibly dense. The tree canopy interlocked completely, blocking out the majority of the afternoon sunlight. I hiked for roughly 4 hours, navigating entirely by compass and GPS, pushing through heavy undergrowth and crossing shallow, freezing creeks. The silence of the deep woods began to press against my eardrums. There were no birds, no insects buzzing, just the heavy crunch of my own boots hitting the dirt. I found the lodge just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. It sat in a small clearing. The structure was a single-story cabin built from thick, dark timber. It was slowly rotting into the earth, the roof sagging heavily under the weight of accumulated moss and dead branches. The windows were boarded up from the inside with thick plywood. There was no visible path leading to the front porch, no fire pit, no signs of recent human habitation. It looked like a forgotten relic of the past century. I walked up the rotting wooden steps. The wood groaned under my weight. The front door was a heavy slab of solid oak, swollen with decades of moisture, sitting crooked in its frame. I pressed my shoulder against the wood and pushed. The hinges screamed, a sharp, metallic shrieking that echoed violently across the quiet clearing, and the door scraped inward across the floor. I stepped over the threshold and turned on my heavy flashlight. The beam cut through the thick darkness of the cabin. The smell hit me immediately. It was a dense, suffocating odor of stale dust, dry rot, and a sharp synthetic chemical scent that aggressively burned the back of my throat. I swept the bright beam across the walls. The interior was completely stripped of furniture. There were no chairs, no tables, no hunting trophies mounted on the walls. I lowered the beam to inspect the floor. My boots were resting on a surface that did not feel like wood. The texture was smooth, slightly yielding, and entirely uniform. I aimed the flashlight directly down at my feet. The entire floor of the massive main room was covered in a thick, overlapping layer of glossy photographs. I dropped to one knee to examine the surface closely. The photographs were standard 4x6 prints. They were laid out with an obsessive, terrifying precision, overlapping at the edges by exactly 1/4 of an inch, creating a seamless, impenetrable carpet over the original hardwood. A thick, clear layer of adhesive coated the entire mosaic, locking the pictures permanently to the wood and creating that sharp chemical smell I had noticed upon entry. I ran the beam of light slowly across the room. There had to be thousands of them. They covered every single square inch of the floor, extending all the way to the baseboards, wrapping around the corners, flowing seamlessly toward a closed door at the back of the cabin. I looked closely at the picture directly beneath my right boot. It was a photograph of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. He was standing in what looked like a brightly lit basement. I looked at the photograph next to it. A young girl wearing a faded yellow dress sitting on a concrete floor. I moved the light, illuminating dozens of pictures in a tight circle around me. Every single photograph featured a different child. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The subjects varied in age, ranging from toddlers to young teenagers. The backgrounds varied as well. Some were outside in dense foliage, some were inside barren rooms, some were in the back of a cargo van. But there was one terrifying, consistent detail in every single image. Every child was staring directly into the lens of the camera. Their expressions were entirely uniform. There was no smiling, there was no crying. They all bore the exact same expression of profound, paralyzing terror. Their eyes were wide, their posture stiff, capturing the absolute climax of human fear frozen in glossy paper. I stood up slowly, my breathing growing shallow. The sheer scale of the horror beneath my feet was completely overwhelming. I swept the light across the room again, recognizing the sheer volume of human lives cemented the floorboards. As the beam caught a cluster of photos near the center of the room, my heart dropped in my foot. I walked over to the spot, stepping carefully, my boots squeaking slightly against the adhesive coating. I aimed the light at a specific photograph. It was a boy with distinct asymmetrical freckles across his nose and a small scar above his left eyebrow. I stared at the face, my mind racing through a massive catalog of true crime reports, missing person databases, and archived news broadcasts I had consumed over the years. I recognized him. I vividly remembered his face printed in cheap black ink on a missing poster taped to a telephone pole near my childhood home 20 years ago. I moved the light to the left. A girl with distinctively braided hair. I remembered seeing a news article about a local hunter finding her remains discarded near an interstate highway overpass 5 years ago. I moved the light again. Another face I recognized from a grainy television broadcast. Another face from a high-profile cold case documentary. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to vomit. I backed away from the center of the room, desperate to escape the thousands of dead eyes staring up at me from the beam of my flashlight. I moved toward the back of the cabin, my boots finding a heavy wooden door. The photographs flowed perfectly beneath the gap under the door. I grabbed the cold brass handle and turned. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open. It revealed a small, windowless office space. The photo carpet continued in here, covering the entire floor. In the center of the room sat a heavy, battered metal desk and a single wooden chair. There was a secondary door on the far wall, secured with a massive, heavy-duty steel padlock. The hinges on the locked door were thick, suggesting a reinforced basement or holding cell beyond the wood. I approached the metal desk. Resting directly in the center of the rusted surface was a leather-bound notebook. I set my heavy flashlight down on the desk, aiming the beam toward the ceiling to cast a diffused glow across the small room. I reached out and opened the notebook. The pages were filled with a frantic, cramped, deeply pressed handwriting. The ink was dark, smudged in places where the author's hand had sweated against the paper. The entries were not dated by the calendar, but by a running tally of numbers. I began to read. The author was the killer. The early entries detailed the mechanics of his hunting. He described his methods with a cold, clinical detachment, detailing the vast geographic distances he covered to avoid establishing a recognizable pattern for law enforcement. He utilized the massive, unmarked forests to dispose of the evidence, burying the remains deep in the earth where the roots and moisture would destroy the biology. But the tone of the journal shifted abruptly, about halfway through the book. The clinical detachment dissolved into unraveling paranoia. He stopped writing about the hunting and started writing about the hands. "They do not stay in the dirt," one entry read, the pen pressing so hard it nearly torn the paper. "I put them 6 feet deep in the clay. I pack the earth tight, but they push through. The soil does not hold them. The wood does not hold them. They reach up from the ground. Small hands, gray skin, cold fingers. They grab at my ankles when I walk through the brush. They reach through the floorboards of the cabin while I sleep." I turned the page. The handwriting grew larger and more chaotic. I woke up and they were holding me down, dozens of small hands reaching straight through the solid oak of the bed frame. They are trying to pull me down into the earth. They want to drag me into the dark with them. I cannot cut them. The knife passes right through the flesh, but their grip is solid iron. The next few pages detailed a rapid descent into terror. The killer described running from the remote disposal sites, barricading himself in the cabin, only to watch the small, gray hands effortlessly breach the foundation, reaching up through the floor to claw at his legs. He described the agonizing cold of their touch, the relentless, silent pulling. Then, I found the entry that explained the floor. "They cannot touch the faces. The eyes repel them. I dropped a picture during a breach. The hand touched the glossy paper and burned. It retreated. The paper holds the memory of the fear. The paper holds the absolute authority I had over them in that final moment. I am the apex. The image proves it. The hands cannot breach the evidence of their own submission. I read the final entry in the book. I covered the wood, every inch. The glue seals the barrier. I stand on their faces and I am safe. Good thing I harvested so many over the years. 30 years of work, and now they protect me. They pave my sanctuary. I walk on my trophies, and the hands remain trapped in the dirt below the foundation. I stepped back from the middle desk, the leather notebook slipping from my fingers and slapping shut. I looked down at the faces staring up at me from the floor of the office. I needed to leave. I had enough information. I needed to hike back to my truck, drive until I found a cell signal, and bring an army of federal investigators to this cabin. I turned away from the desk to retrieve my flashlight. As I pivoted, the heavy tread of my right boot caught the edge of a photograph near the leg of the desk. The adhesive in this specific corner had dried out and failed. The thick, glossy paper snagged in the deep grooves of my soul. With a large ripping sound, a large sheet of 4 overlapping photographs tore loose from the floorboard. I stumbled slightly, kicking the loose photos aside. A patch of bare, rotting oak floorboard, roughly a foot wide, was completely exposed to the air. I regained my balance and looked down at the exposed wood. The grain of the oak began to ripple. The solid structure of the timber simply distorted, the dense wood flowing and separating like a thick liquid. A hand reached up through the solid floorboard. It was incredibly small. The skin was a pale necrotic gray, stretched tight over the thin bones. The fingernails were cracked, packed thick with dark, wet soil. It pushed up through the wood until the wrist was exposed, the fingers grasping blindly at the empty air. I stood completely frozen, my mind entirely unable to process the impossibility occurring inches from my boots. I thought the killer had a psychotic delusion, but he was perfectly, horrifyingly sane. The small, gray hand snapped toward my leg. It moved with a sudden, vicious speed. The cold fingers wrapped tightly around my left ankle. The sensation was shocking. The skin was freezing cold, burning through the fabric of my hiking pants, radiating an intense, agonizing chill that immediately numbed my lower leg. The hand pulled downward. The sheer force behind the small fingers was massive. My boot scraped violently across the glossy photos as I was dragged toward the exposed patch of bare wood. I shouted in panic, throwing my weight backward. I kicked out with my free leg, driving the heel of my right boot directly into the gray wrist. My boot did not connect with solid bone. It passed completely through the gray flesh, encountering absolutely no resistance, as if I had kicked a column of dense smoke. Yet, the hand gripping my ankle remained perfectly solid, continuing to pull me toward the floorboards. I twisted my body violently, throwing myself backward onto the securely glued photographs. The sudden shift in leverage tore my ankle out of the small grip. The moment my leg crossed the boundary of the photographs, the gray hand stopped. It hovered over the bare patch of wood, its fingers twitching, the knuckles scraping against the air directly above the photos. Unable to cross the perimeter, the glossy paper barrier functioned exactly as the notebook described. The intense gaze of the frozen faces repelled the hand. The hand slowly sank back down into the floorboard. The solid oak rippled briefly, and then the grain soothed out, leaving the wood entirely undisturbed. I scrambled backward, pushing myself away from the bare patch, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I sat on the layer of photographs, staring at the empty wood. Heavy footsteps thudded loudly against the wooden planks of the front porch. I snapped my head toward the open doorway of the office. A large figure stepped through the front entrance of the cabin. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy faded canvas hunting jacket and mud-caked boots. His face was deeply weathered, lined with decades of harsh sun and isolation. He possessed a thick, untrimmed gray beard and dark, deeply sunken eyes. He was holding a hunting knife. He stopped just inside the threshold, staring at the open me, his face contorted into a mask of fury. "You stepped on them," the old man growled. He racked the bolt of the rifle, sliding a heavy brass cartridge into the chamber with a sharp metallic clack. He brought the stock of the weapon up to his shoulder, aiming the barrel directly through the doorway toward the office. I scrambled to my feet. I was trapped in the small, windowless room. The heavy locked door on the back wall offered no escape. The killer was blocking the only exit, standing comfortably in the main room, his boots planted firmly on the overlapping photos. "You ruined the seal," he shouted, stepping slowly toward me, keeping the rifle perfectly leveled at my chest. "You broke the floor. They are going to get in." "Wait," I yelled, holding my hands up, pressing my back against the locked door. "I just found this place. I'm leaving. I won't tell anyone." The old man let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You are not leaving," he said, stepping into the doorway of the office. The barrel of the rifle did not waver. His dark eyes flicked to the notebook sitting on the desk, then down to the small patch of bare wood I had exposed near the chair. His expression shifted from anger to absolute paralyzing panic. "You peeled it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You exposed the wood." He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a manic. "Stand exactly where you are," the killer ordered, his finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "Do not move an inch. I'm going to put a round through your heart, and then I'm going to use your blood to glue those papers back down before they smell the gap." I looked at his boots. He was standing completely on the photograph, securely protected by the barrier of staring faces. I looked down at my own feet. The massive sheet of overlapping photographs I had accidentally kicked loose was resting just inches from my right boot. The adhesive binding the 4 pictures together created a stiff, durable mat. I formed a desperate, suicidal plan. "I know what is under the floor," I said, keeping my voice steady, staring directly into his sunken eyes. The old man blinked, momentarily confused. I grabbed the flashlight sitting on the edge of the metal desk. Without warning, I hurled the heavy aluminum cylinder directly at his face. The killer flinched, pulling the rifle slightly off target to avoid the projectile. The flashlight grazed his shoulder, clattering loudly against the wall behind him. The high-lumen beam spun wildly across the room. It bought me exactly 1 second. I dropped to the floor, throwing my body flat against the photograph carpet. I reached out with both hands and I grabbed the thick, stiff edge of the loose photo mat near my boots. I pulled my knees up to my chest, braced my boots against the solid leg of the metal desk, and violently ripped the massive sheet of interconnected photographs directly out from under the killer's feet. The sound of the adhesive tearing was incredibly loud. A massive strip of the floor covering, nearly 3 feet wide and stretching across the doorway, ripped away from the wood. The killer lost his balance as the surface beneath him shifted. He stumbled forward, stepping entirely off the remaining photographs and planting both of his heavy boots directly onto the bare, rotting oak floorboards of the threshold. He raised his rifle to fire, recovering his balance instantly. Before he could depress the trigger, the wood beneath his boots violently rippled. The solid oak dissolved into a fluid, chaotic surface. Dozens of small, pale gray hands erupted simultaneously from the bare floorboards. They shot upward with terrifying, coordinated speed. The necrotic gray fingers grabbed the thick leather of his boots, the denim of his jeans, and the fabric of his heavy canvas coat. The small hands possessed an impossible, overwhelming physical strength. The killer screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of devastating terror. He dropped the hunting rifle, the weapon clattering uselessly onto the bare wood. He threw his arms down, trying to tear the small hands off his legs, but his fingers passed completely through their spectral flesh. The hands gripped him with iron force and pulled downward. His boots vanished through the floor, then his knees. The wood seemed to effortlessly absorb his mass, pulling him straight. The wood seemed to effortlessly absorb his mass, pulling him straight down into the dirt foundation beneath the cabin. He clawed frantically at the bare floorboards, his fingernails splintering the wood, screaming for mercy, begging the empty room to let him go. The small gray hands multiplied, hundreds of them reaching up through the timber, wrapping around his torso, his neck, his face. They dragged his head through the solid floorboard. His final muffled scream was instantly silenced as his mouth passed through the wood. The gray hands sank back down into the oak. The rippling wood smoothed out. The floorboards returned to their solid state. The heavy hunting rifle lay on the bare timber, the only remaining evidence that the killer had been standing there seconds before. The deafening silence of the deep woods rushed back into the cabin, filling the space left by the screaming. I lay flat on the floor, my chest heaving, my clothes soaked in cold sweat. I did not move for a long time. I stared at the bare patch of wood, terrified that the small hand would reach back up for me, but the wood remained still. Eventually, I slowly pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. I remained strictly on the surface of the photographs, ensuring no part of my body crossed the perimeter of the bare wood. I reached out and carefully backed out of the office. I walked across the main room, tracing my exact path, stepping only on the staring faces of the children. I reached the front door, stepped out onto the porch, and walked into the night air. I hiked back to my truck in a total, unthinking daze. I did not use the compass, I simply walked through the dark forest, driven by adrenaline-fueled survival instinct, until I hit the dirt logging road. I locked myself in the cab of my truck, turned on the heater full blast, and drove until the sun came up. I have not contacted the authorities. I cannot bring the police to that cabin. If an investigative team walks into that room, they will step off the photographs. They will tear up the floor to search for the bodies. I cannot be responsible for exposing innocent people to the things waiting in the dirt beneath that foundation. I am posting this here because the isolation of what I know is slowly destroying me. I know he was a monster. I know the faces glued to the floor demanded justice, and I know he suffered a fate perfectly aligned with the suffering he caused. But the knowledge that I crossed the line, that I actively participated in dragging a screaming man into the solid earth, is a weight I do not know how to carry. I am a murderer now too, and I'm terrified that one day, when I'm standing on bare wood, a small, gray hand is going to reach up and grab my ankle. This next one is from Horror Junkie 123. Growing up, my grandparents had one rule: don't look in Pappy's private room. When I was 16, I was sent to live with my grandparents for a month. I hadn't been there in years, but I had a strained relationship with my parents, and they thought a visit to the middle of nowhere would somehow ease the tension between us. Really, I think they just wanted to get away from me. Whatever the case, that trip to the countryside changed my life forever, in worse ways than I ever imagined. "Bye, sweetie, behave," my mother said, waving out the window as her SUV kicked up a trail of dust. "Try to contain your excitement a little, jeez," I mumbled, turning to my smiling grandparents. "Oh, Stephen, we are so happy that you're staying with us," Grandma said, beaming at me. Her warmth was infectious. Pappy didn't say anything at first. He just clasped a meaty hand onto my shoulder. "She's right, we don't get many visitors." I grinned at him, even though internally I was screaming. "Happy to be here," I replied, praying that my facade would hold. "Come on," Grandma said, ushering me inside. "I'll show you your room." The moment my grandmother left me, I whipped out my cell phone. To my horror, I discovered that I had no service. My grandparents were old school. They didn't have Wi-Fi, every teenager's worst nightmare. "Hey, Pap," I said as I clopped down the stairs. He glanced up at me from his crossword, indicating for me to speak. My grandfather wasn't the most social man. He had a stern, no-nonsense demeanor, and he had the build to match the intimidating aura. A little part of me was always a bit afraid of him. Suddenly, my question felt absurdly stupid. Do you have internet out here? He eyed me for a moment, before nodding to a dinosaur of a monitor. That's all we got. No internet connection to it, though. My heart dropped. I had a feeling that it was going to be a long summer. 2 days later, I found myself exploring the basement. It was the least inviting part of the house, poorly lit with cobwebs everywhere and a thick layer of dust coated everything in sight. Probably not the safest place to be, but I was bored with nothing better to do. As I pulled the switch to the single light bulb dangling from the ceiling, something immediately drew my attention. A door. A single wooden door at the far end of the basement. To my surprise, there was a note nailed to it. "Stay out, Pappy." It was obviously intended for me. The message immediately spiked my curiosity. I made my way over to it, tiptoeing across the dirt floor. It felt like I was doing something illegal, like I was about to take a leap that I couldn't take back, and that feeling was exhilarating. Once I reached my destination, my heart pounded in my throat. I took a deep breath as I reached for the knob. A boost of adrenaline surged through me as I twisted and locked. I should have known. I turned to leave and cause mischief elsewhere, and the excitement of the situation deflated. The second I did, I stopped in my tracks. Someone was blocking my path. The color drained from my face as I realized who it was. My grandfather. "What are you doing down here?" It wasn't a question. I was just looking around," I said, flashing him a weak smile. Pappy glowered down at me, his hulking frame looming overhead like a shadow. He stood there in silence for a moment before he spoke. "Get out. I don't want to see you down here again." "Yes, sir." He didn't have to tell me twice. I swerved around and bolted back up the stairs, his burning scowl following me the entire way. I had to know what was behind that door. Pappy was obviously hiding something that he didn't want me to see. I couldn't go back down there so soon after being caught, though. No, I definitely couldn't take that risk. I decided to wait until he was out at the store to make my move. Little did I know an opportunity would present itself sooner than I expected. That same night, I awoke at an odd hour with the sudden urge to pee. I groggily slipped out of bed, did my business, and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. Once I was satisfied, I crept back to my room, careful not to wake Pappy and Grandma. And that's when I heard it. I had just reached the top of the landing, when a low rustling emerged from somewhere deeper in the house. I don't know why I didn't go back to bed, but for whatever reason, I sat on my haunches at the top of the landing, invisible in the darkness. Footsteps clunked along the floor, and the shadow of my grandfather's towering frame came into view. He paused in the kitchen as if he could sense my presence. For a moment, I thought he'd caught me, but to my relief, he eventually continued on his path. My brows furrowed. What was he doing down there? Being the nosy teenager I was, I had to find out. My heart dropped when I heard a door creak open. The basement. He must have been going into his secret room. I descended the stairs as quietly as I could, blood pounding in my ears like thunder. When I reached the bottom, my eyes immediately fell to the opened basement door. I scampered down the second set of steps, careful to avoid any noisy floorboards. I froze halfway and watched. Pappy was standing there on the opposite side of the room. He rummaged around behind an old dusty painting resting against the wall before producing a rusted key. He inserted it into the lock and the space was illuminated with light. At that moment, my heart nearly exploded. I didn't know for certain, but I could have sworn that I saw crimson splattered on the floor. Curiosity gnawed at me like a piranha. I had to know what was in that room. I knew where Pappy was hiding the key, but I was too paranoid to check at night. He'd gotten the drop on me the last time. I didn't want to find out what would happen if he caught me again. As much as it pained me to do it, I went along with my original plan. I waited until Pappy went to the store to make my move. "Going to get milk. Be back soon," he grumbled to Grandma as he snatched his keys from the hook. "Okay, be safe," she said, returning to the pie that she was preparing in the kitchen. That was my golden opportunity. I put down the newspaper that I'd been reading and opened the door to the basement as quietly as I could. My heart pounded with each tiny creak. Fortunately for me, Grandma's hearing wasn't the best, and she didn't pick up on anything out of the ordinary. I practically flew down the stairs. I was itching to know what was inside that room. I leaned the painting forward and retrieved the key, turning to the door. The sign that Pappy had made was still there, looming over me like a sentry. My hand trembled as I placed the key in the lock and turned. This was it. Nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to witness. Dried blood caked the floor. A metal work table sat to my right with a wide array of tools. Pliers, hacksaws, hammers, their blades crusted in flaky crimson. At the far end of the room I saw corkboard. Dozens of newspaper articles and pictures of missing people were pinned to it. And to my left, that was what nearly made me pass out. A yellowed, dingy mattress sat in the corner. On top of it lay a corpse, maggots writhing in and out of every emaciated orifice. Its eyes were wide open, and its mouth had stiffened into a permanent scream. I took a step back as the putrid stench assaulted my nose. But just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, a sound from behind me made me freeze. Click. I slowly turned around to find my grandfather standing there, a 6-shooter trained on me. Pappy, I thought you were at the store, I squeaked, my voice weak and brittle. Forgot my wallet. He scowled at me, delivering the most hateful glare that I have ever seen in my life. He sighed, breaking the silence permeating between us. You've seen too much, boy. I didn't want it to come to this, but you've left me no choice. Pow! A deafening gunshot ripped through the air. For a moment, I didn't feel a thing. The adrenaline surging through my system made sure of that. But when I looked down, I came to the sickening realization that my arm was blossoming with red. Arnold, what was that? Grandma shouted from upstairs. Nothing, ignore it. To my shock, she didn't reply. How much did she know? Your grandmother's going to be upset when she finds out, Pappy said, this time raising the gun to my head and cocking the hammer. But she'll get over it, eventually. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I couldn't. My fight or flight response kicked in just at the right time. I bolted forward, the sound of the bullet whizzing past my temple, ringing in my ear as I went. I shoved my grandfather and he stumbled, dropping the gun. I didn't stop. I leapt up the stairs, darted into the foyer, and swiped Pappy's spare set of keys from the hook. I heard his pounding footsteps pursuing me as I made a mad dash for his truck. Get back here! The sound of his voice booming from the depths of the basement only made me run faster. I crashed outside, unlocked the truck, and threw myself in the driver's seat. Pappy appeared in the doorway as I threw the vehicle into drive. Crash! I instinctively ducked my head as the left side mirror shattered. Pappy didn't try to shoot me. He stood there, that awful glare burning a hole into my head, as I floored it down the dirt road and far away from that house. I kept driving until I reached the nearest town. Fortunately, the bullet had only grazed me, so I wasn't in need of immediate medical attention. The police investigated my grandparents' house, and what they found still haunts me to this day. The bodies of my grandparents were recovered from the home. The gun was still warm in Pappy's hand when they found him. After a thorough investigation, my grandfather's crimes were made public. Aside from himself and my grandmother, he was linked to the disappearances of 13 people, and it's thought that he could have had more victims. I had to attend therapy for years afterward just to feel normal again. Now, all this time later, I'm just thankful that I made it out of the house alive. And that's the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this one. That one story in the beginning about the haunted house was so great. There's actually a part 2 to it, so let me know in the comments if you made it this far, if you want to hear the part 2, and then maybe a future video, just let me know. And hell yeah, thanks for watching everybody. Good night, everyone, and sweet dreams.